Ivone, if I could make a couple of remarks. Mark and I, and Marlene as well, checking in with her, remember your earlier comment that we shouldn't talk of God, that we can put away the Bible and better solve problems as a focus, if you remember saying that.
Yes.
Yes, and then we read a historian, MacCulloch, who records a lot of the sins of the church. And William, you recently blogged and cited one of his ideas, which this is MacCulloch now. Mm-hmm. Throughout the world at the present day, which is, I think, your point, Ivone, we got to be in the present moment. The most easily heard tone in religion is a generally angry conservatism. Why? And I'm wondering what a theologian has to say about this. I'm wondering, that's a historian speaking. And I'm wondering in your background as students of theology and practitioners and writers using theology, do you address a generally angry conservatism?
Okay, so before your question, Rachel, I received two questions from William regarding the amnesia of the church, and also I received the questions of Mark regarding the work of historians about false ideas or true ideas and so on. So my first point is to say that today saying something from myself, from my experience, and maybe from a very small experience of people, not only scholars, but common people that have the same perception that we spoke too much about a kind of principle that we call God, that we talk too much about the reality with a kind of theory that we call it God. Now, since I was waiting for your call, I was listening, watching the TV about the impeachment of our president, and about now we are 27 deputies that vote. Most is for the impeachment, but among these 27, almost 12 talk in the name of God, putting the country in a very bad situation, but they are doing in the name of the people and in the name of God. I feel more and more and more like a very small position. I can feel the world as so complex, so divided, and so what I call the truth, or a truth for me, is not. I'm sure that is not also to my church, also to my religious congregation. So I feel myself invited to think about the meaning of the truth, or I prefer do not speak about the truth, or maybe the better is truths, and truths are very more simple and complex at the same time, because it's connected to every human life. And what it was true for a group is not for another group. When I was preparing my doctoral thesis on Paul Ricoeur, and and Paul Ricoeur have a book called History and Truth. Complex issues that you never can find one thing that you say, this is the truth. There are different perceptions. So in the same perspective, historians, his name Diarmaid, MacCulloch, I love very much the article, very, very much. I love it very much. And I feel how much also for him showing histories about the amnesia. It's very good for us, but probably in that time most of people wasn't aware about the lies that today I see, the lies of the church. So I would say that at each moment, each situation, each interpretation, you can recover something that was affirmed as true, and I can say it's not, and it's not for me, it's not for my group, it's not for people that are in my own environment. I would say that all the issues that I share with you, that Rachel remind us now about God, I am very, very aware that maybe I can share these ideas with a very small group. Can you imagine that 1 month ago I was invited to talk in a parish. I am never invited, but I was. And when I finished the talk about religion and gender issues, the priest read a letter from a man that I was dangerous for the church, to say that I capture as truth for human being, for women are considered as not built families, are considered as a kind of the enemy of the church. What we call truths are very relative. It's not absolute. So, William?
I suppose if you had asked me these questions before this weekend, I would be thinking differently about them. As you know, I mentioned on my blog that I spent the weekend at a conference sponsored by a Black Baptist church in Little Rock about including and welcoming LGBT people within the Black church. This conference turned out to be bigger, I guess is the word I would use, than I anticipated, in that it drew people from all over the country. I thought it was going to be just a local conference, including people who have long been leaders in movements to open the Christian churches in the United States to greater racial inclusivity and greater inclusivity of sexual minorities. For example, Gilbert Caldwell, who's 82 years old, who collaborated and marched with Dr. King, was there. He's a leader in the United Methodist Church, has been repeatedly arrested at general conferences of the United Methodist Church for protesting the teaching in the Book of Discipline, which says that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with the Christian faith. And he spoke at the conference this weekend as a highlight of his own faith journey over 82 years, which was interesting. One of the things that interested me about this conference and relates directly to the question you asked is that there were repeated conversations among the people attending the conference about the success that the political and religious right continue to have in employing language about God, the name of God, the term God, repeatedly. This may be a peculiarly American phenomenon because we're a nation with the soul of a church, but we're living through a moment when there are now over 100 bills in state legislatures in the United States directly targeting LGBTQ people and employing the name of God as they do so. And as people at the conference said, this sort of gives the rest of us no choice if we believe that this is an inappropriate and even demonic way of using the name of God, except to speak back, to claim the name of God back from people who are using it in this way to target and demean other human beings. And of course, this perspective comes out of a Black church experience where talking about God is a familiar thing. It's something that energizes Black communities of faith, and the church remains within the Black community a kind of organizing body that holds people together. That's the perspective that I brought out of this conference this weekend that I would bring to your question.
I would like to say that what you shared with us shows a kind of social function of God, a political function of God. So God has a multiple social functions. He or she or it can help powerful people, poor people, women, gay men. I remember once I was invited to lecture also in an LGBT conference, and it was very interesting to listen questions as do you think God love us? Why? Because the political structure of the church obeyed to an order, a sexual order, a political order, hierarchical political order, and it's a kind God is in the top, the top of the theory of order, the top
Yes.
A theory of protection, the top of the theory of creation. So I think that this idea can help, or the stop idea can help, but also can be very, very oppressive. And most of us, as me and you and Rachel and Marlene and Mark and others, maybe we discover how much this idea of God is very dangerous.
Yes.
For making justice, for personal responsibility, and so on.
I agree, Ivone, and on that point, I hear what you're saying very clearly. There's a way in which the saturation of political discourse with religious discourse and with the name of God creates tremendous danger and difficulty, including for people of faith. For one thing, it brings God into the political sphere, the public square, the world in which we live as a sort of commodity that we can trade with as we produce political effects and so forth. I think the big challenge that we face today is that so many movements politically want to tag their political aspirations to this religious language. And so that gives the rest of us the obligation to push back. I saw a headline before I logged on a few minutes ago. I haven't read the article, but it said, Donald Trump reveals his favorite Bible verse. And a part of me wants to know, part of me doesn't want to know. But the challenge this produces is political leaders who are willing to quote the Bible when everything about what they're offering us contradicts what many of us see as the basic message of the Christian and Jewish scriptures. There was an interesting observation, and I typed it. I may be able to pull it up and read it to you. I don't know if this is obscuring my face. I'm so non-capable. One of the people who spoke at the conference on a panel discussion was a Latino man involved in a movement called Church Within a Church. And I think that this is a movement within the United Methodist Church, as well as I understand, for inclusivity of LGBTQ people. He said something that struck me, and I wrote it down. He said, African Americans were taught the Christianity of the slaveholder, but Latinos were taught the Christianity of the conquistador. And then he went on to say, it behooves the oppressor to teach the most conservative form of his Christianity possible. And that strikes me as corroborating what you say, Ivone, about the imagination of God as up there controlling the rest of us, and how that hierarchical imagination is constructed for social reasons, for political reasons, to keep certain people within their places.
And also for psychological reasons.
Yes.
I think that people psychologically have fear, lots of fear. Fear to die, fear to have hunger, not having jobs, or not having good health. So fear to lose people that we love. Mm-hmm. So I think that fear is a kind of important component of our psychological human life. So psychologically, you have to feel protected, possessed, and not dispossessed. So goddess, plural, not only one God, but goddess has this kind of psychological function to keep me protected. I will be not afraid in my sorrows or in my anguish, and so on. So religion create a kind of secure world that give to lots of people. Of course, we have to critique also, but I think that psychologically is something very important. To stress.
Yeah.
I do agree with it. I think that's a very important point. And again, it echoes discussions at this conference this weekend, there was a presentation by a pastor of an African American church in Washington, D.C., Dennis Wiley, and his wife co-pastor this particular church, which led the way in inviting same-sex couples to marry within an African American church. And one of the points he made during his presentation repeatedly was, we within the Black Christian community need to be much more critical of our use of the term God and of our religious language, because we often use these terms in a way that is psychologically meaningful to us. It gives us comfort, but it also reinforces theological ideas that now we're trying to critique as we deal with the inclusion of sexual minorities in the church. And I thought that was a point well taken, and it's one that was repeated by others during the discussions this weekend. The challenge within the Black church to deal with the highly conservative kind of religion, which is often peddled by the church itself and by Black ministers. This is a challenge that the Black Lives Matter movement and also the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina have both dealt with head on. Mm-hmm. They've butted heads with the pastors in many Black churches by inviting to the table LGBTQ people and including them as equals in the Black Lives Matter movement and Moral Mondays movement. Great promise there.
I want to interrupt just a moment, William, because I would like both of you to answer. Well, what sort of God can account for insecurity?
Did you say account, Rachel? Account for
insecurity, which is what you're saying, and we meet chaos all the time. Okay, and punishment. So yes. What sort of God, as theologians, can you propose is fit for the role?
My proposal is to be silent, and to stress more the relationship among us. Say that, for instance, Rachel, I need your help. Marlene, I need your help. Mark, I need your help. William, please come. I can understand what is happening now. I have to confess that when poor people comes to talk with me and they are talking all the time that God did this or God did that, why God killed my son. I just have a visit of a woman that lost her son, and she said to me, why God take my son from me? Why? So I don't answer, oh, God loves you. No, I say, I don't know, but you have friends, you have another son, a daughter. Maybe this is the mystery of our life. So I say something like this, but also I cry with her. I think that the answer for me is not discover special image of God, because I am criticizing God's proximity, maybe reading poetry or a novel that can help me, or listening music, but for me, especially talking with people, talking, and saying that is very heavy. Is a good idea to help people, to support, to be a support, to have a support in your life, to have a kind of reference. And Rachel, I am entering in your specialty, but I love psychology, and I can imagine psychologically that when a poor woman say to me like this, God knows, He knows. I say to her, you know your suffering, you know. Oh yes, I know my sufferings. It's a kind of joking, but at the same time saying to her, it's you that know your suffering, and it's from you that the solution could arise. It's something like this, William.
Well, I couldn't say this more beautifully than you already did, Ivone. Your statement, I prefer the insecurity of human love, of human proximity, and then you spoke of tears, of words, of touch, of poetry, of music. I think we invoke the name of God so often in human encounters as a kind of blasphemy. Why do we need to bring the name of God into a human encounter in which a touch or a tear conveys what we imagine we're conveying by invoking the name of God? I think of how often in the Gospels, rather than talking, Jesus handed people something to eat when they were hungry. He spat on the ground and took the mud and placed it on the eyes of the blind person. He mysteriously wrote in the dust when the woman was accused of adultery. He wasn't always going around saying, God, God, God. He was touching people. He was doing something effective with people. So I think there's a whole theology. There's a universe of theology there in the Gospels.
And theology is not from God.
No.
It's from our capacity of being.
Yes.
It's our capacity to have a heart open to others. I'm sure that I don't have always my heart open to others, but when I am converted to others, my heart can be open. I can be close to. I can understand more. I can not judge all the time. You make this. You are different. My thoughts are. I feel that. God became a kind of good relationship with myself, with the world. God with us is like this. It's reinterpreting the gospel is God among us is it's really good, the good among us, doing good for others and for myself, which is very hard because I think that a patriarchal religion interprets more doing to the others,
yes,
not to yourself, but to the others, and you feel a little bit guilty if you are doing something for yourself. I learned too much during my illness about also receiving from the others as a good thing, not a God thing, but a good thing.
Yes.
So I'm mixing good and God.
Put another word out there for you to each to elaborate on mystery.
Why I keep the word mystery? Because in human relationship, also in the universe, I am thinking on Thomas Berry, the history of the universe. In the universe, in the life of plants, in the life of different animals, of birds, of insects. We are surrounded by mystery. We have no property on the knowledge of all those beings. And also, I don't know all the stories and the history of human beings. I write a book of history of the ages. I write this book because I discover when perspective seems to me interesting. I just read a novel from a French woman, Carola Martinez. It's very interesting. It's about a woman of the 12th century. She decided not to marry the man that her father wanted she to marry, and she decided to cloister herself, to live since the age of 15 years in a kind of tomb with a small window where people give her food. But it's a very interesting story, and it seems that I never heard. So I am searching, and I ask a friend of mine, which is historian, if those women existed. And it seems, yes, that in the Middle Age, this kind of women exist, and their discourse is, I will be the spouse of God. Can you imagine? So the idea of refuse the order of a father way is to say I will be married with God, and so on. So it's very interesting to say. So I can write a story, but it's a very small perspective, and each historian is working with a very small part of the history. No one of us can have the totally of the history.
Ivone, is hard to follow because what you say is so powerful that I don't honestly know what I can add. I'm very much struck by your statement that mystery means that we don't own the rest of the creative world as our own property, and we don't know all the stories of everyone, including the non-humans in the world, in a way that we can claim those stories as property.
Could you apply it to the people who do not understand gay marriage?
The term mystery?
Yes.
I'm not sure what you mean, Rachel. Can you?
Well, I'm thinking of your dialogue with them, something like what Ivone is saying. There's a dialogue which she opens herself to the other person's perspective and learns something. So I'm wondering, on occasion, in your dialogue with those who do not understand marriage between two men or two women,
I suppose that I would think for dialogue like that to be fruitful, there has to be on both sides the recognition that there is this mystery between us that we're trying. We know that we will never completely understand or fathom, and we may view it very differently, but there's an openness to the mystery dimension of the conversation. I don't sense that openness very often among those who oppose same-sex marriage. I think part of the problem is that very often their position is that they have the truth, and it's an adamant position. It's a non-negotiable position. If I have the truth, you can't possibly have it, and therefore I have to convert you or shut you up because that's what people with the truth do. One of the questions I often, when I attend a conference like the one I attended this weekend, find myself asking questions and jotting them down, which are in some ways unrelated to the conference itself. And one of the questions that struck me as I listened to the various conversations at the conference is a question about the recent papal document, Amoris Laetitia, and why there's this need, as I read the document, both through the silence about LGBT people and then through the little bit that's said, which is positively nasty. Why is the holiness of some people in the world to be purchased at the expense of other people? What you say sort of frames that for me as a question of trauma. There's a sense of trauma within the rest of the Christian body, which I think ultimately has to do with the renegotiation of gender in the modern world. There's a trauma within the church because it's so deeply constructed around a male-ordained hierarchy. It's a trauma about the rise of women to personhood, the stepping out on the stage of human history and the claim to autonomy. And this trauma is being lived out in often such nasty ways. The implication that my holiness depends on making you less, on beating you up, on diminishing you. What kind of holiness is really built that way? Is it holy?
I agree totally with what you are saying. I think also in regarding the question of about trauma that we are in patriarchal cultures. We are educated that there is an order that exists history. You have to sorry for my English. I can't explain very well my thoughts. Enter inside this pre-existent order. The Church, Roman Catholic Church particularly, knows this order, and they say that this order comes from God. Can you imagine for a young man, a gay young man, what kind of trauma for him or for her to discover that he is against this order? So he is dispossessed by this order, and he is dispossessed of what is his body. by disorder. So in my understanding, the trauma comes also because we live with a kind of pre-established order coming from God, or coming from nature, or coming from our familiar traditions, or from our culture, and so on. So we never allow the eruption of the originality of each person. Sorry.
Yes. Yes, that makes perfect sense to me, Ivone. I also think this is backing up a bit, but it's very much related, at least to my way of thinking. Part of the damage that's done by invoking the idea of God and then adding to it this notion of a rigid order that is somehow grounded in God. God always imagined as a man and as a heterosexual one. Part of the damage is that we lose sight of the analogical nature of everything we say about God. We somehow imagine that we're talking about this thing that's there in the room about which we all have a clear imagination, and that is the furthest removed, really, from the basic insights of Christian theology about God. God is not that kind of thing, and our language is entirely analogical. It's an attempt in a very halting way, in a very imperfect way, to throw up metaphors out of our human experience that somehow reach toward our experience of the divine. This is where I see the importance of history, and this returns to your first question, Rachel. Yeah. History keeps our discussion of religion grounded in the real world. Religion has a tendency, especially in patriarchal iterations, to take flight from the real world into the abstract, into that realm of perfect order that it wants to impose on the world. And history moves precisely in the opposite direction. It cuts against the grain of the abstraction. It forces us to keep seeing the real world. We know from an article in New York Times today that Georgetown University founded itself on money that it gained by selling over 250 enslaved African Americans. We, within the Christian churches, keep trying to deny and diminish our complicity in the sin of slavery, and yet that's a glaring reminder that there it is right here in American history. One of our leading Jesuit institutions was founded on not only the sale of slaves, but the breaking up of slave families. These were Catholic enslaved people who had been baptized, who were sent with promises that they would not have their families broken up, and yet the promises were not honored.
William, do you know that in Brazil, during the period of colonization, when slaves are allowed, each Benedictine Franciscan fathers, they can have until 3 slaves. I don't know in the United States, but here they were allowed to have their own slaves.
Absolutely. In North America, too. My college alma mater is Loyola, New Orleans, and just as with Georgetown, the money that was used to build the university came from slave plantations, sugarcane plantations in South Louisiana. The Ursuline sisters owned slaves and would not admit women of color when colored women wanted to join. These were women of mixed blood, so that they had to found their own religious communities. So Yes. Bishops in the U.S. owned slaves.
And of course, MacCulloch mentions slavery specifically.
Yes.
And I was thinking about this historical amnesia of the church, and I would like to stress a need to make distinction, because when we talk about church, normally we can ask what church. Of course, we are not talking about Christian communities. We are talking about the officials of the church, about the government of the church. We are talking about pope, bishops, and priests, and so on. So I would like to make the distinction, because when I talk about Brazil, the government of Brazil, it's one thing. The people of Brazil is another entity, another complexity. So until now, this last document, of this last exhortation of the Pope, that I make a comment, especially regarding the critique of gender ideology, and it will be published probably next week.
Good.
So I don't know, but because now all the conference of bishops, they are against the ideology of gender, and they do not understand what it means.
No.
Trying to, when people say the church says, I say, who says? Oh, the bishop. Okay, the bishop is not the church. Is an official of it's yours. He has to serve the community. He is not the community. To expand this idea of not identify church to the officials, or if they prefer to identify, I want to talk about church and community. So it's two different things. And so the church as the officials, they have the amnesia. But when I watch the history of Brazil, for instance, I can see black people inspired by the gospel, struggling against slavery. There are a leader of what we call quilombos, which is the community of black people. His name is Zumbi. He was a black and gay man, and he was recognized as a leader, not, of course, not by the church, but by the community. I am always now stressing the distinction and saying we do not have to make the history only from powerful people, from the officials, but try to make another history. For instance, all the MacCulloch remember this story of the Virgin Mary and the suffragists, for instance. Why the church developed the idea of the Virgin Mary with a child and a good mother? Why? Because at the same moment, in England particularly, women was doing a wonderful movement called the suffrage, and and moving in different industries and enterprises, saying no, we want to vote, so the church take the Virgin Mary as the ideal, the icon, as the Pope still now talk about the icon of the Virgin Mary, the icon of the Sacred Family. So Christian values are recovered by different groups of people, and they can live as community, but not as church in a patriarchal meaning.
It was Vatican II, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was Vatican II
People of
straight.
God.
I haven't gotten there yet. What is it about theology and history? What kind of a comment would you really like to make about these two meeting and kissing, theology and history?
I avoided, I suppose because I have felt alienated from the world of theology for some time, I avoided reading books like Elizabeth Johnson's She Who Is. And yet when I read that book, I was very happy that I did so, because she opens that book by grounding all of the theology of God, about which she talks in an abstract way in the book, in historical movements. She talks, for example, about how difficult it remains now to talk about God at all in any meaningful way after the Holocaust. And she surveys all of the discussion of that question, especially in German theology, following the Nazi period. The question, what's left to say, how can we even use the name of God any longer? I would say a book like her book, She Who Is, gives me heart that it's possible to marry theology and history. She refuses to ignore the significance of history as she talks about the abstract theology of God. That's not how the theology of God has often been done within the Catholic tradition. And I wonder if it's part of what got her into such trouble with the American Catholic bishops.
I feel that all the marriage of theology and history, I agree with the exceptions that William share about Elizabeth Johnson and others. Rosemary Ruther, also she did a lot of things about, but still all these issues are not studied in the academia, in the faculties of theology, as history of the church. What is called the history of the church and the history of theology, in fact, is the history of popes and bishops, or the history of the ideas of very important men, as Thomas Aquinas, as Karl Rahner, as Skillebeeckx. I love Skillebeeckx, but its history of theology is the history of the thought of those men. Elizabeth Johnson as Catholic, Mary Hunt as Catholic, Janet Walton as Catholic, and Rosemary Ruther or Fiorenza. They are not part of the history of the Catholic theology. Catholic tradition is selective only for men and for women that can be integrated, totally integrated the male ideas.
Yes.
So history is a very limited history where the subjects of this history is the action of men, honorable men of the church. As well as in the past, the history of France was the history of the kings and queens of England the same. So the church also, the history of the theology of church is the history of aristocratic person.
Yeah. The essay that Mary Hunt published about the papal exhortation at Religion Dispatches, she points out that the text repeatedly uses the phrase, the Synod Fathers said, the Synod Fathers did. And she says, you know, we had these meetings that were supposedly meetings of a much broader community within the church. How did we get from those meetings to the Synod Fathers said, you know, and there's absolutely no voice of women whatsoever in this exhortation, nor was there in Laudato Si.
Address of this exhortation is, my brothers, bishops,
yes, yeah,
and deacons,
yes.
and finally all the people of the church, but
yes.
not common people. And the language, it's so far from the real problems of people.
It is, and ironically talking about family and the experience of family.
Yeah.
Could we be more divorced from the real world?
Exactly. There's a psychological problem.
I am reading now much more Judith Butler. I don't know if, and I am discovering in her a very interesting political philosopher. Of course, people from Catholic Church and also Protestant Church don't like her position because she opened the bodies. She asked, it's the name of her book, Bodies That Matter. So what bodies matter for the Pope, you know, in this document? It's idealistic bodies, not real bodies. Mm-hmm. So I feel really very sad because here in Brazil there are a kind of very good appreciation of the Pope, absolutely. And I am considered as a critique of the Pope. Can you imagine people like Leonardo Boff? He loves all the ideas of the Pope, and I am critique of the Pope. So it's very, very uncomfortable because he is from Argentina, Latin America, and he never was from liberation theology, but now as he invited Boff and Gutierrez to talk with him, to inspire him, so he became a liberation theologian.
Here's a last question, maybe.
Yes.
What is possible for theology to guide us through the wreckage we read about in history?
I would take what Ivone just said about the absence of the experiences and the voices of so many people who constitute the church and deserve to have their voices heard and their experiences honored. I would say that the only way that we can successfully navigate the wreckage of history theologically is by radically broadening the canon of people who count, people whose voices count. Mm-hmm. It cannot be the Synod Fathers said, my brother Bishop said. We won't negotiate the wreckage of history that way. A recurring question that was asked at the conference I attended this weekend, what do we do about the fact that we now have, for the first time in our history as African Americans, a significant proportion of young people who have completely turned their back on the church? That's not only a question for the African American community, it's a question across the board for this generation. You know, it's easy to show that in North America at least, and I think in much of the rest of the Christian world, young people have walked away from the Christian churches. And I would say one of the reasons they've walked away is that the canon has been constructed in such a way that it only includes those voices of the Synod Fathers, the brother bishops. And of course people are going to walk away when their own experience is not reflected. Family is being talked about, but they're not asked to have a voice in the discussion when they are invited in very selective ways to have a voice. Then the documents are compiled to say this is what was said, and nothing that they said appears in the final documents.
I will be disappointing you because people says that I am a theologian. I'm no more sure that I am theologian in the following the meaning of Roman Catholic Church. I don't know. Certainly not. First of all, I think that I am not worried to be recognized by the church. To be recognized by scholars of Catholic universities. Mm-hmm. Probably because I am an old woman. Probably I dare to say this because I'm not now looking for my bread to eat. I am a retired woman. It gives me some freedom to say that I prefer to listen to be attentive to my inner light, as Quakers say, and to be very attentive to my friends, to talk with them, to feel different things. Also talk with people, very simple people, and recognize that we can help one another without the recognition of a party or a church. So maybe we are part of a movement outside official church. But we are a movement. We are lots of people connected. And I thank you very much, Rachel and Mark, because you have this idea to put us together. So it makes our world more bigger, and my faith with people that can support me, because I knew William, and Rachel, I met her in Chile, Marlene, a long time ago, but Mark now, so that we can be a kind of community of meaning, and a community of meaning that helps us to say, I am not alone.
Yes.
In the way of thinking and acting in this world.
I second Ivone's thanks to you, Rachel and Mark and Marlene, for helping to put us together as a community of meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you too.
Yeah. Oh, it's
You expressed it so beautifully, Ivone, how I feel at this point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of my heroes is the historian Howard Zinn, who wrote People's History of America. And he states, I hope we can find the future in history's fleeting moments of compassion rather than its solid centuries of warfare.
Oh,
I think that's what we're trying to do here, keep the spark of compassion and empathy alive.
I agree.
I agree too.
Yeah. Well, I agree too. I really agree. We got somewhere.
Yes.
Very much. Abraço.
Abraço grande.
Thank you, Chris, for your work.
Yes.
Yes.
To us. Thank you. Have a nice night now.
Thank you. You too.
You too. Dorme bem.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Abraço. That's beautiful.